An abrupt about-turn by President Donald Trump on troop movements is overshadowing a meeting of NATO leaders in Sweden. Now, the administration said earlier this month that it would withdraw some 5,000 military personnel from Europe and was canceling a deployment to Poland. Now, Trump says that an extra 5,000 troops will be sent to Poland. Trump backed Poland's President Karol Nawrocki in elections last year.
NATO foreign ministers were all smiles as they gathered in Sweden, but deep divisions remain between the NATO members and the US, who was represented by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Many were left surprised and puzzled by Trump's apparent U-turn on deploying extra troops to Poland. The Swedish Foreign Minister summed up what many NATO members were thinking.
Well, it is confusing, indeed, and not always easy to navigate. I welcome if they increase their presence in Poland, since it's on the eastern flank where we have the big threat, just like you said.
Divisions within NATO have grown since Trump took office, as the US has clashed with its European allies on a number of issues. Trump's interest in acquiring the Danish territory of Greenland created an unprecedented dispute within the alliance. Tensions have emerged over Ukraine, as the US has reduced support. And the Trump administration has also slammed NATO members for failing to provide support in its war with Iran. Under pressure from the US, European allies have signalled a willingness to join a naval mission to secure shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, a key demand of the Trump administration. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said NATO members are working on a plan to secure the strait.
It is important that countries are coming together around plans to ensure that the strait can be open for transit, including by moving essential assets to the region. This is another clear reminder of how security challenges are increasingly interconnected, and that allies and partners have a strong interest in working closely and proactively together.
Marco Rubio warned that NATO members must address divisions in the alliance and openly posed the question of why the US was even a member of NATO.
I don't think anyone is shocked to know that the United States, and the president in particular, is very disappointed at NATO right now. Why is NATO good for America? Because it gives us bases in the region that allow us to project power during a contingency in the Middle East or somewhere else. So when that is the key rationale for why you're in NATO, and then you have countries like Spain denying us the use of these bases, well, then why are you in NATO?
Rubio said the issues dividing NATO must be dealt with at a summit of NATO leaders in Ankara in July. Rubio described it as probably one of the most important leaders' summits in the history of NATO.
NDW correspondent Teri Schultz has been at the NATO meeting. I asked her about the message the Americans are sending.
Well, Sarah, that really depends on which messages you're talking about. And there were really two tracks here when it comes to U.S. interests. You know, first of all, this meeting was being held under the expectation that they would be discussing a pullout of thousands of U.S. troops from along the eastern flank from Poland and possibly Lithuania and Estonia. Of course, that was reversed overnight just as ministers came into their meeting today. So the strain of that situation was eased somewhat, although nobody knows exactly what to expect, where those troops would come from, when they would arrive, whether this is the rotation that was canceled or delayed. So there's a lot of confusion on that. But the other situation here is that European countries really don't support what the U.S. and Israel did with Iran. They called this a war of choice by the United States, and their populations still don't support their governments helping in any kind of offensive action. So being democracies, they're not going to change their opinion on that. What they say they will do is help secure navigation in the Strait of Hormuz once all hostilities are ceased, once a ceasefire has been signed. And while there didn't appear to be really progress on that and not much was expected here, there was open conversation with Secretary of State Rubio, and everyone seemed to feel like the tension was at least eased a bit, even if there's not a solution yet.
And NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and others have been going to great lengths, we have to say, to keep the U.S. on board when it comes to European defense. What's the strategy, Teri? How do you see it, and do you think it's working?
they're not going to be able to convince the Trump administration not to draw down their presence on the European continent. That's just a fact. That's something that Trump has been warning about even since his first administration, but certainly much more intensively in his second administration. The plans for that are already drawn up, and we believe that some of those plans were already shared this afternoon at NATO headquarters back in Brussels in a meeting of defense policy directors, although Mark Rutte described those conversations as highly classified and said that he at least wouldn't be sharing details of them. We don't know exactly what was discussed there, but we understand that the U.S. laid out some longer-term plans for continued drawdowns. Now, again, the stress over this possible immediate cutback of thousands of troops to Poland seems to have been rectified for the moment, but that doesn't change the fact that long-term the U.S. is definitely not going to have such a strong presence here, and that could affect NATO's ability to deal with any kind of attack on one of its allies. This is expected to affect what's called NATO force model, and that is exactly the plans for dealing with a crisis. We don't know exactly how deep those cuts might be, where they might come from, or when they might take effect.
And Teri, Trump has said that the additional 5,000 troops, which will now be sent to Poland, is due to his good relationship with the Polish president. Can you fill us in on the background there?
Yes, well, you can't take this question without the other announcement that Trump made, and that is that 5,000 troops would be withdrawn from Germany. So he made this announcement, but in fact, we learned later that, in fact, no troops will be withdrawn from Germany at the moment. In fact, what he did was cancel a deployment of some 4,000 troops to Poland. Now, that didn't make sense to a lot of people because Poland was not supposed to be punished by this. As Trump said, it was about his dispute with Chancellor Merz. So now everything is up in the air. It's not clear whether Poland is going to be getting 5,000 more troops or whether it's just the cancellation of the deployment. You can see how confusing this gets. We're not exactly sure how many troops may be headed to Poland, but people are celebrating, and that's in fact the word that they're using here at the meeting, the fact that Poland has been recognized as a strong ally, and President Trump has personally recognized that troops should not be withdrawn from the eastern flank at this moment. So it remains to be seen how that all works out, but you can't take the dissatisfaction with the German government separately from his determination not to punish Poland for that decision.
Regardless, no matter how you look at it, European leaders are certainly on watch. What action have European allies already taken to try and shore up NATO's eastern flank with Russia and Ukraine on their own?
You're right. They've been warned for a long time that they're going to have to do more on their own. And in fact, almost all of the eastern flank countries are already spending well over 4%, some of them over 5% of their GDP on defense. Now, that's a goal that the rest of NATO has only pledged to make by the year 2035. So that's why these countries feel like they should not be the ones who are punished when President Trump gets angry at NATO. And that's why this announcement about Poland, of course, caused such disappointment. But they have been spending more along the eastern flank. They've been buying a lot of U.S. weapons. They also already have in all 8 frontline countries with Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia what are called forward operating forces. They're by NATO, already international troops there protecting the eastern flank, and not all of those troops are backed up by Americans. Some countries don't have any U.S. troops there. So certainly Europe has been taking more responsibility. At the same time, some of the things we're talking about when we talk about the U.S. withdrawing its support are technical matters, are capabilities like long-range missiles and interceptors that Europe simply doesn't make at the moment. And they certainly haven't moved fast enough to fill those gaps. They're starting to do that now, but it will take years before they can actually support themselves and replace the capabilities that the U.S. now possesses by itself.
TW's Teri Schultz, thank you.
Let's explore more of this with Olaf Böhnke, who's Germany director for Rasmussen Global, the geopolitical advisory firm of former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Welcome to DW. Have we heard anything new from Marco Rubio in Helsingborg?
No, Rubio continues to play the role of the rationale in this administration, and it would make total sense. So what he said is a very is the outline of a very strategic approach. The US is reshuffling their troops. They pay more attention to areas like the Middle East or Asia. But this is in total contradiction to what the president is tweeting overnight. And that's, I think, what's puzzling everyone, that the one is what nice guys like Mr. Rubio is saying, and the other thing is the confusion the president is causing by its midnight social media activities.
Okay, so Marco Rubio saying, this is a problem we have to deal with, same problem, let's talk about it. The president, meanwhile, is just doing what he does. But can you answer Marco Rubio's question about why NATO is good for the United States?
Of course, because it gives stability in an area where also Russia is testing the alliance, it's testing also the kind of how much of a superpower is the US. And again, I think the establishment on both sides of the aisle in Washington, Republicans as Democrats, are willing to pay for security in that global dimension. And of course, the expectation still is that Europe needs to do more. So this is now less about promises, but it's about delivery.
I just want to press you on that, because I hear what you've said a lot. And what I don't hear is, in naked terms, the sort of terms a US president would appreciate. If you leave NATO, you lose this. Okay, so we heard Marco Rubio saying that this is a way for American troops in Europe is a way for America to protect power. America doesn't need NATO to do multilateral deals to project power. So once again, what's the big argument for the United States? If you leave NATO, you lose this. This is why the US needs to be in.
I mean, have a look at in the situation of the Middle East, or there Trump actually decided to go on its own with his ally Israel, and he was of the expectation that he can get the Iranian regime down within a couple of days. So we are now in more than 2 months of this military attack, and it's still going on. And I don't have the impression that the US are winning this war. So every deadline the president said was withdrawn. So now they also put in pressure. So we heard what Marco Rubio was saying. The expectation, of course, are that NATO allies should also support the US in the Strait of Hormuz. What the Europeans are discussing right now, and this is where the difference between European and the US allies are, is that the plan for European NATO allies to support the US is once there is a peace agreement, or at least there's a ceasefire. What we just learned from Marco Rubio is that maybe we should also prepare a situation and a scenario actually where the US is still fighting and still expecting NATO allies to come to their side. And that's, of course, something which is challenging the NATO alliance a lot.
Can you not see how your answer effectively makes the US argument, right? NATO, yes, the United States is in a mess in Iran, potentially because NATO allies refuse to back it. Therefore, Donald Trump says, well, what's the point of you lot? We arrive where we started. My question to you is, where's the benefit where is the naked benefit to the United States from continuing to be in NATO? Everything that you've said is either about the status quo or about how Europe benefits. Talk to us about what the US gets out of this.
I mean, I'm not a NATO spokesperson, neither for the European allies.
Okay,
I still believe that no, we can't take this. I mean, imagine a scenario where not only the US is fighting against Iran, but also where China is all of a sudden increasing its pressure and military pressure on Taiwan. And if Russia will also increase their attacks abroad, beyond the Ukrainian border. So that would create a scenario where US superpower is challenged. And I think that only in a NATO context, as the alliance, you can back this and counter this. So the situation of NATO right now is far away from being perfect, and I totally share the point of the U.S. administration saying, why should American taxpayers pay for European security? That's a call experts like me had made over years. Finally, the European Union, the European allies actually are living up to this. As I said at the beginning, this is not about promises any longer, but it is actually about delivery. And this is now where they need to come to terms and demonstrate that they're really doing something. What they have done at the eastern flank, you can say it is moving in this direction.
Okay.
European taking responsibility.
Thank you so much for joining us, though. Olaf Böhnke from Rasmussen Global.